Imagine for a second that you're making this just fantastic salary. Let's say you're taking home over $100,000 a year.
Right. Living the dream.
Exactly. And by all outward appearances, you are thriving. But then, at the end of every year, you sit down with your accountant
Mhm.
and they show you this piece of paper proving that despite this massive cash flow, your actual total net worth just shrank.
Ouch. Yeah, that's rough.
Right. You are mathematically poorer than you were 12 months ago. Now, take that deeply unsettling scenario and imagine it happening not just to one person, but to an entire sovereign nation.
It's a profound contradiction, really, and yet it's the exact reality for several economies globally. When you look past the superficial metrics,
Yeah.
we're conditioned to look at a high income and just immediately equate it with wealth creation.
Yeah.
But income and wealth are two vastly different economic concepts.
And that contradiction is exactly why we are here today. If you're listening to this, I am talking directly to you, our fellow curious mind.
Oh,
We have prepared a highly tailored deep dive for you. And our mission today is pretty ambitious. We are plunging into a massive, and I mean a truly massive, stack of macroeconomic, environmental, and social development data concerning the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago.
often abbreviated in our data sets as TTO, yeah. It's an absolutely fascinating case study because Trinidad and Tobago is a nation at a historic crossroads right now.
Yeah, it really is.
The surface level data tells this story of triumph, but the deeper structural data, the data on institutions, on human health, on capital flows,
Yeah.
it tells a story of a system under immense, almost existential strain.
Exactly. And to make this mountain of data digestible for you, we're going to build a mental framework today. Think of it as a mental slide deck.
I like that, a visual guide.
Right, but picture a stark, minimalist, academic visual presentation, pure white backgrounds, stark, dark gray text, no distracting 3D graphics or drop shadows or gradients.
Just pure hard data speaking the truth.
Exactly. The only color we're using is sharp red and blue arrows to highlight the crucial trends. Key data points are just circled with thin, solid lines. So let's paint that first mental image. Slide 1. The hook.
Okay, let's see it.
On the left, picture a massive upward-pointing blue arrow. It shows TTO's GDP per capita breaking the $17,000 mark.
Which is huge.
Right. In constant 2015 US dollars, that puts Trinidad and Tobago firmly, unequivocally in the high income bracket. But on the right side of this slide, there's a jagged, bright red arrow crashing downwards.
The other shoe dropping.
Yeah, and that red arrow represents energy depletion adjusted net savings. So here's the core mystery we are posing to you today. How does a nation with such incredibly high income end up shrinking its true national savings? Where is all this wealth really going?
To answer that impartially, we have to completely discard the traditional GDP dashboard. We just have to toss it.
Throw it out.
Pretty much. We have to look at the underlying structural realities of TTO. Earning a high GDP by rapidly depleting finite natural resources in this case, vast reserves of oil and natural gas, it's an economic illusion.
Right.
The traditional GDP metric is actually highly misleading in this context because it counts the liquidation of a physical asset as pure income.
Wait, let me stop you right there and push back a little. If the country has oil and they pull it out of the ground and sell it on the global market for a massive profit, I mean, how is that an illusion? Cash is cash, right?
Yeah.
It goes right into the national treasury.
It's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of what economists call adjusted net savings. Let's use an analogy. Imagine you inherit this massive estate from your grandparents.
Okay, I'm listening.
The estate is worth $50 million, but it's mostly in the form of antique gold bars sitting in a vault. Every year, you take $1 million worth of gold out of the vault, you sell it, and you use the cash to live an incredibly lavish lifestyle.
I'm throwing great parties. I have a very high cash flow.
You do. Your income for the year, if we measure it strictly by cash generated, is $1 million. You feel rich.
Everyone thinks I'm rich.
Right. But did you actually create any new wealth? No. You just converted an existing asset into cash and consumed it. Your overall net worth didn't grow. In fact, because you spent the cash, your net worth shrank by $1 million.
Oh, man. Yeah, that hurts to think about.
Adjusted net savings does exactly this calculation for a country. It takes the gross savings of a nation, but then it subtracts the value of the natural resources that were permanently extracted and sold off.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So let's bring up our second mental slide, the Energy Dependence Foundation. When we look at this dual-axis chart for TTO, what does that depletion actually look like?
It's staggering. I mean, truly, the primary axis shows that amazing GDP climb from around $4,200 up to over $17,000. But the secondary axis, the bar chart showing energy depletion as a percentage of gross national income, or GNI, it shows this depletion consuming an astounding 29 to over 32% of the nation's wealth in peak years.
Wait, over 30%? So nearly a third of their entire national income in those peak years was just the sheer liquidation of the family silver.
Exactly. And when an economy becomes that deeply reliant on the extraction of fossil fuels, it falls into the grip of what economists call the resource curse.
The resources.
Yeah. The high revenues from energy create this facade of perpetual prosperity. It masks the fact that the foundational asset base of the country is physically disappearing. But more dangerously, it begins to actively warp and distort every other sector of the economy.
How so? Walk me through the mechanism of that, because logically, if I have a ton of oil wealth pouring into my country, shouldn't that make everything else better?
You would think so.
Right. Shouldn't I be able to build better farms, better factories, fund tech startups?
Right, but the macroeconomic mechanics actually work in the exact opposite direction. This brings us to slide 3, and a phenomenon known as Dutch disease.
Dutch disease?
Yeah. To understand why other sectors fail, we have to look at what happens to the currency and the labor market when an energy boom hits. When TTO exports massive amounts of oil and gas, foreign countries have to buy TTO's local currency to pay for it, or the massive influx of US dollars drives up the local exchange rate.
So the local currency becomes extremely strong.
Yes. A strong currency sounds good, but it's fatal for domestic production. Let's say you're a local farmer in Trinidad trying to sell tomatoes, or a local manufacturer trying to sell shirts.
Okay.
Because your national currency is so strong, it becomes incredibly cheap for the country to just import tomatoes and shirts from abroad. Meanwhile, if you try to export your locally grown tomatoes, they are far too expensive for anyone else in the world to buy because your currency is artificially inflated by the oil money.
Oh, wow. So you're structurally priced out of the global market and even your own domestic market.
Precisely. And it happens in the labor market, too. The energy sector is incredibly lucrative, so it can afford to pay massive wages. This sucks all the top engineering talent, the best managers, the heavy capital investment, right out of the rest of the economy.
So there's a brain drain into oil.
Exactly. I mean, why would a brilliant engineer try to build a highly risky local tech startup when they can get a guaranteed massive salary working for a petrochemical firm?
Yeah, you wouldn't. So if all the capital and labor is being sucked into the energy sector, what happens to the guy trying to run that tomato farm?
Well, let's look at the data.
Right, let's look at our mental area chart on slide 3 showing the economic makeup. Industry, which here is basically petrochemicals and services, absolutely swallow the entire graph. But when I look for agriculture, I have to draw a tiny, almost invisible red circle at the very bottom. The data shows it hovering at a mere 0.4 to 0.7% of GDP.
Less than 1%.
Less than 1%. That's insane.
It's a textbook manifestation of Dutch disease. The agricultural sector has essentially been hollowed out.
But wait, how do they eat? If an island nation is producing less than 1% of its economy in agriculture, the food security risks must be terrifying.
They're entirely reliant on global supply chains and foreign exchange reserves to feed their population. When you produce less than 1% in agriculture, it means almost every grain of rice, every piece of meat, every processed good has to arrive on a ship.
Wow.
Looking at this impartially, strictly from a data perspective, it creates a profound structural vulnerability. If global energy prices dip, which, they frequently do, the nation's ability to generate the foreign currency needed to buy food is immediately threatened.
They are trading finite, volatile energy for daily sustenance.
Exactly.
And smart money knows this, which is the perfect transition to mental slide 4 and the next deeply concerning data point in our stack, foreign direct investment, or FDI.
Right, the capital flows.
Picture a waterfall chart here. Zero axis in the middle. In the early years of this data set, we see strong net inflows of FDI. Money was pouring in from abroad, upwards of 10% of GDP, but recently, the data completely inverts. We see a stark, bright red downward arrow plunging into negative territory, net outflows hitting negative 1.7%, and in some years, plummeting to negative 5.9%.
That's a massive reversal.
Capital is actively fleeing the country.
It is. And this is a critical diagnostic indicator. Foreign direct investment isn't just like hot money moving in and out of a stock market. FDI represents physical, long-term investments, building factories, establishing regional headquarters, laying down infrastructure. It is inherently forward-looking.
Let me play devil's advocate here for a second, though. Couldn't a drop in FDI just be a reflection of global macroeconomic trends? Like, if the U.S. Federal Reserve raises interest rates, capital naturally flows back to the U.S. Why are we so sure this is investors losing faith in TTO specifically?
That is a very fair point, and global interest rates absolutely play a role. However, when we look at sustained net negative FDI in a high-income nation, it tells a more specific story. A net outflow signifies that foreign firms operating in TTO, and potentially even domestic entities, are choosing to repatriate their profits abroad rather than reinvesting them back into the local economy.
So they make a profit pumping oil, but instead of using that profit to build a new research facility in Trinidad, they just wire the money back to London or Houston.
Exactly. They are extracting the returns, but leaving the long-term risk behind.
Yeah.
And why are they doing that? Because global capital is reading the long-term signals regarding decarbonization.
Ah, they see the writing on the wall.
They do. They understand that a traditional energy-bound economy has a limited horizon. They look at the hollowed-out agriculture, the lack of diversification, and they calculate that the long-term growth prospects outside of energy just aren't there yet to justify reinvestment. They see the trust fund running out.
Man, that is a bleak assessment from the global market. But the data stack we're looking at goes even deeper than capital flight. It brings us to the hidden, often uncounted polls of running a pure extraction economy.
The environmental costs.
Exactly. Mental slide 5. And listener, this is where the macroeconomic accounting gets very real. I want to talk about the physical cost of all this petrochemical activity.
It's significant.
The data set includes a metric for the cost of carbon dioxide emission damages. Picture a stark gray silhouette of smog in the background of a line graph. The line tracking this cost is spiking. We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars annually. The data shows this hidden cost devouring up to 3% of the country's gross national income.
And it is vital to understand that the World Bank and modern macroeconomists generally do not treat this as just some abstract environmental issue. This isn't about saving a rainforest out of purely moral goodwill.
Right.
This is a strict, hard-nosed accounting deficit.
Explain that. How does a ton of invisible gas in the air translate to hundreds of millions of dollars in macroeconomic drag?
Because emissions cause measurable physical damage that society ultimately has to pay for. It accelerates infrastructure degradation due to extreme weather. It destroys coastal assets through sea level rise. And crucially, it creates massive public health burdens. Respiratory illnesses, increased hospitalizations.
And all of that requires hard cash to fix.
Yes. When we go back to that adjusted net savings figure we talked about on slide 1, you have to subtract the cost of these emissions.
So it's like running a factory that makes $1 million in profit on paper, but the production process slowly releases a chemical that rots the foundation of the factory itself and causes $1.5 million in structural damage to the surrounding town. The profit is a mirage.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. And the situation is becoming even more precarious for TTO because of shifts in global trade.
You mean carbon pricing?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Major economic blocs, like the European Union, are implementing carbon border adjustment mechanisms, essentially carbon tariffs.
Oh, wow.
If you are a country with high carbon intensity, the hidden cost of your emissions is no longer just a domestic problem. It is going to become an explicit, unavoidable financial penalty applied to your exports at the border. It actively mathematically erodes the actual wealth the country is trying to build.
Okay, so let's put ourselves in the shoes of TTO's leadership for a minute. You know the oil is finite. You know the carbon emissions are destroying your net savings and will soon be taxed globally. You have to pivot, diversify, build new, clean industries. So why is it so hard to just do that?
It's the million-dollar question.
Right. Why not just pass some laws, offer some tax breaks, and become the Silicon Valley of the Caribbean?
Because to build an entirely new type of economy, you need the proper foundational hardware. And in macroeconomics, the hardware of a nation is its institutions.
Okay, institutions.
Its government efficacy, its rule of law, its ability to control corruption.
And that brings us to slide 6, the governance bottleneck. And the data we have on TTO's institutions is, well, it's stubbornly average.
Very stubborn.
Picture a radar chart or a horizontal bar chart. We draw a dotted line right at the 50th percentile mark. And when we track rule of law and corruption control, TTO is trapped right around that median. For years, the data just fluctuates horizontally right between 40 and 50%.
Maintaining strict political neutrality here, as we always do. We just have to look at what the historical economic data tells us about development. And this pattern points to a very well-documented phenomenon known as the middle-income institutional trap.
I have to admit, I'm a bit confused by that term. If you're at the 50th percentile globally, that means you're right in the middle. Your average isn't average. Fine. Why is it a trap that prevents diversification?
It's a trap because different phases of economic development require vastly different levels of institutional complexity. Let's think about a resource extraction economy. An oil state can actually function incredibly well and generate massive GDP with mediocre or even highly corrupt institutions.
Wait, really? Why is that?
Because the wealth is generated by a handful of massive, highly centralized contracts.
Yeah.
You have a national energy company partnering with a few global supermajors. An oil rig pumps the oil, a pipeline moves it, a tanker ships it out.
That's simple.
Exactly. It's capital intensive, but it is not administratively complex for the broader society. You do not need a highly sophisticated, infinitely nuanced, transparent legal system operating at the grassroots level just to sign a billion-dollar offshore drilling lease. The money flows straight to the top.
But a diversified economy is the exact opposite of that.
Radically opposite.
Yeah.
If you want to transition to a knowledge-based economy, say software development, high-end manufacturing, biotech, you are no longer relying on 3 massive contracts. You are relying on 3,000 or 30,000 small and medium-sized enterprises.
And those small businesses need a completely different environment to survive.
They require immense societal trust. They need agile, transparent legal systems to protect intellectual property, enforce contracts quickly, and resolve disputes without bribery. They need incredibly low administrative friction to incorporate higher and secure loans.
And if they don't have that,
When a nation's institutions stall out at the global median, the environment is simply too sluggish, too unpredictable, and too risky for that kind of complex, decentralized economic ecosystem to take root.
I love analogies, so let me try this one. It's like trying to run a cutting-edge artificial intelligence software company, but you're forcing everyone to use computers from 2005. The hardware, the institutions, they just can't process the complex demands of economic diversification. It just freezes up.
That is a perfect analogy.
Ah.
This system just crashes. And if we connect this back to our earlier point on slide 4, the capital flight, the plunging FDI, it all links together.
Right.
Global investors look at the institutional hardware of TTO. They realize the legal and administrative framework hasn't been upgraded to support the next phase of economic growth, the non-oil phase. So, assessing the risk, they take their money elsewhere.
It is a frustrating systemic bottleneck. The hardware just isn't there to run the new software. But as we transition into part 3 of our deep dive, the human capital equation, we start to see that the hardware isn't the only thing under stress.
No, it's not.
The people are too. And at the end of the day, an economy isn't just oil rigs and legal codes. It is simply people waking up every day, making and doing things. Let's bring up mental slide 7, the demographic data.
Human capital is the ultimate arbiter of long-term economic destiny, and the demographic shifts happening in Trinidad and Tobago are profound.
They really are. Picture a population pyramid. Over time, we can see the broad base of the pyramid. The youth, ages 0 to 14, is visibly shrinking. It's pulling inward. Meanwhile, the top of the pyramid, the population age 65 and older, has swollen. From an early baseline of just 3 or 4%, it has now crossed over 10% and continues to climb.
What the data is showing us is the end of the demographic dividend.
Explain that for the listener. What is the demographic dividend, and why is it so crucial for economic growth?
Historically, many developing nations hit a sweet spot where birth rates start to fall, but people are living longer. This creates a temporary bulge in the middle, a massive generation of working-age people. During this phase, you have a huge labor force and relatively few dependents.
Meaning fewer young children to pay schooling for and fewer elderly people requiring pensions and heavy health care.
Exactly. So you have maximum workers and minimum dependents. It is an economic super engine. It frees up massive amounts of capital for investment and drives rapid GDP growth. The Asian tigers utilize this brilliantly.
Right, South Korea, Taiwan.
Yes, but it is temporary. And the data dictates that TTO is undergoing an irreversible structural shift out of this phase. Their engine is slowing down.
And the timing of this is just brutal, isn't it?
It is the worst possible timing. They're losing that demographic dividend exactly at the historical moment. They need young, adaptable, technologically fluent workers to pivot the economy away from fossil fuels. An aging population means higher healthcare costs, heavier pension burdens on the state, and a shrinking pool of prime-age labor right when economic reinvention demands maximum vitality.
So logically, if the sheer number of young workers is shrinking, the quality of their education becomes the single most critical variable. If you only have half the youth you used to have, you need every single one of those young minds firing on all cylinders to compete globally.
Which brings us to the education data on slide 8. And this presents a very complex dual narrative.
Right. Picture a dumbbell plot for this mental slide. We're looking at basic education metrics, specifically comparing male versus female outcomes, and the baseline actually looks incredibly strong. Primary school completion rates are stellar. They are consistently over 90%.
And we must recognize that as a massive, crucial achievement. It means the physical infrastructure for basic literacy and numeracy is universally established across the islands.
But there is a glaring red flag in the data set. While the completion rate is high, the out-of-school rates for primary-age children show these sudden, alarming, violent spikes in certain years. The data shows it hitting 16.4% for boys and 17.3% for girls. I have to admit, I'm struggling to understand the logic here.
It seems contradictory, doesn't it?
Yeah. How can you have a 90% completion rate but simultaneously see a 17% dropout rate in the middle of the data set? What's actually happening on the ground?
It does seem contradictory until you understand how the data is captured and what it signifies about systemic resilience. The high completion rate shows the system's capacity in normal times. But those severe spikes in dropout rates don't happen in a vacuum. They typically correlate with external shocks.
Like an economic downturn when oil prices crash?
Exactly. Or localized institutional failures, or public health crises. What this data indicates is a deep vulnerability in the social safety net. When times get tough, a significant percentage of families are forced to pull their children out of primary school. Perhaps they can't afford transportation or uniforms, or the child is actually needed for informal labor to help the family survive a localized recession.
Man, and the macroeconomic impact of that.
It is catastrophic for long-term diversification. If an economy states that its goal is to become a digital hub or a center for high-value services in the Caribbean, any leaks in the early education pipeline are fatal. You cannot build a resilient, knowledge-based workforce if you are losing double-digit percentages of your youth to economic shocks before they even finish basic schooling. It creates a permanently fractured labor pool.
It's like having a high-performance sports car, but the fuel line has intermittent, massive leaks every time you hit a bump in the road. You can't rely on it to win a long-distance race. But, the human capital data gets even more complex and, frankly, deeply troubling when we look beyond education and look at physical health.
Let's move to slide 9.
The health data is arguably the most critical limiting factor for TTO right now.
Picture a minimalist tree map showing the causes of mortality. If you look at infectious diseases, things like malaria, cholera, tuberculosis, they're tiny. Basically a rounding error, the massive block dominating the screen. Non-communicable diseases, or NCDs.
The chronic condition. Right. The dataset specifically isolates cardiovascular disease and diabetes, noting their devastating, disproportionate impact on the 30 to 70 age group. These are prime working years.
If we connect this to the broader arc of economic development, what we are witnessing is a textbook, severe epidemiological transition.
Break that down for us. What is an epidemiological transition?
As a country's wealth increases, as they move from low income to high income, they gain access to better sanitation, antibiotics, and basic medical care. Consequently, they conquer the infectious diseases that plague poorer nations. That is the first half of the transition.
Which is great news.
It is. But the second half of the transition is where the danger lies. As that wealth increases via resource extraction, the entire lifestyle of the society changes drastically and often way too rapidly.
Wait, let me guess how this connects. Is this linked back to what we discussed earlier on slide 3? The hollowing out of the agricultural sector due to Dutch disease.
You've connected the dots perfectly. The collapse of local agriculture means the nation loses its access to fresh, locally grown whole foods. Instead, they become heavily reliant on imported, highly processed, shelf-stable foods from global supply chains.
Because it's cheaper to import.
Exactly. And these foods are packed with preservatives, refined sugars, and unhealthy fats.
And the nature of work changes too, right?
Drastically. You shift away from manual labor or physical agriculture towards sedentary service jobs or managing automated industrial processes. When you combine a highly processed imported diet with a sudden shift to a sedentary lifestyle, all fueled by the rapid influx of high-energy wealth, you create a perfect, deadly storm for non-communicable diseases like diabetes and heart disease.
Which leads to a data correlation on slide 10 that honestly made me stop and just stare at the screen for a minute. The health and wealth paradox. We plot a scatter graph here. X-axis is economic growth, Y-axis is overweight and obesity prevalence, and it is a stark, undeniable, one-to-one positive correlation.
It's a very clear trend.
As the nation's income goes up, obesity goes up in lockstep. The sources note that children under 5 are showing rising overweight prevalence. But it is especially severe in the adult female population, carrying significant, fluctuating maternal health risks.
It is a profound paradox.
I just want to pause here and let this sink in because it is deeply tragic. Are we saying that their financial success, their literal rise to high income status on the world stage, is the exact mechanism that is making the population physically sick?
The data validates exactly that conclusion. This is the tragic paradox of rapid, resource-driven development. It has happened in other resource-rich nations as well, places like Nauru or certain nations in the Middle East following the oil booms.
Right.
When a nation transitions to high-income status incredibly fast via a single resource, the sudden purchasing power completely outpaces the development of public health infrastructure, nutritional education, and cultural shifts toward preventative care. You have the bank account of a wealthy modern nation, but the nutritional environment of a highly processed, lowest bidder global supply chain.
The human cost is awful. But strictly from the macroeconomic perspective we're taking today, what is the impact of a population battling chronic illness at this scale?
The economic drag is twofold, and it is immense. First, it heavily taxes the healthcare system. Managing chronic diabetes and performing heart surgeries is vastly more expensive than treating acute infectious diseases. It drains public treasury resources that could otherwise be spent on infrastructure or education.
And the second impact?
It removes prime-age workers from the labor force. When people in their 40s and 50s, people who should be the most experienced managers, engineers, and leaders in your economy, when they are forced to retire early due to severe diabetes or are chronically absent due to cardiovascular events, national productivity plummets.
Wow.
It is an enormous invisible drag on the exact human capital required to diversify the economy. You cannot build a new tech sector or a manufacturing base if your most experienced workers are too sick to work.
Okay, let's take stock of where we are. We have an economy heavily reliant on a depleting, finite resource. We have institutional hardware that is struggling to upgrade past the global average. We have a shrinking pool of youth and a severe chronic health crisis among the prime working age adults. That is a heavy, heavy reality check.
It is. But a diagnostic check is only useful if we look at the logistics of how to cure it. We need to look at the physical and digital realities of doing business in TTO right now to see where the path forward lies.
Exactly. Let's pivot to part 4, infrastructure, labor, and the path forward. Because if TTO is going to escape the resource curse, they need to connect with the rest of the world in new ways. Let's look at the physical logistics first on slide 11. For an island nation, shipping is everything.
Absolutely essential.
The data tracks something called the Liner Shipping Connectivity Index.
Okay.
Picture a step chart here. Historically, TTO fluctuated between 15 and 21. But recently, the trend is an undeniable stair-step downward, from a high of 21.7 down to around 15.
And we cannot overstate how critical this metric is. For an island nation, shipping connectivity is oxygen. It is as fundamental to their survival as the interstate highway system is to the United States.
So let's translate this data into reality. What does a drop in this connectivity index actually mean for a port in Trinidad?
The index measures how well a country is connected to global shipping networks. It looks at the number of ships, the container capacity, and the number of shipping companies utilizing the ports. A drop means that fewer major shipping lines are choosing to call at TTO's ports. Or they are coming less frequently. Or worse, it means goods now require multiple transshipments being unloaded and reloaded at intermediate ports to get to and from global markets.
Which means less cargo space, much longer wait times, and skyrocketing costs.
Precisely. It creates an invisible trade barrier. Now, remember what we established earlier, TTO imports almost all its food because agriculture is less than 1% of GDP. This drop in shipping connectivity acts as a massive, invisible tax on the basic caloric intake of the entire population. It makes feeding the country significantly more expensive.
And it must crush any attempt at diversification. If an entrepreneur in Trinidad wants to start exporting a non-oil good, say boutique manufactured items or specialized agricultural products, it suddenly becomes incredibly hard and prohibitively expensive to reach buyers in Europe or Asia. They are physically isolated from the market.
It traps them in the oil economy because oil is shipped on dedicated, specialized tankers, independent of standard container shipping networks.
But surely in the 21st century, physical shipping isn't the only way to export value, right? What about the digital economy? Software, remote services, digital media, you don't need a container ship for that. That brings us to a fascinating split-screen reality on mental slide 12 regarding their digital infrastructure.
This is where we see a glimmer of potential, but also a stark failure of execution.
Let's look at the left side of the split screen. The number of secure internet servers per million people is shooting up exponentially. The physical digital infrastructure is booming. They're getting wired.
That's the good news.
Right. But then we look at the right side, the output. We look at information and communication technology, ICT goods and services, as a percentage of total exports. And it is a flat, microscopic line hovering right at the absolute bottom of the chart. 0.0% in many years. It is essentially non-existent.
It perfectly illustrates the two phases of the digital divide.
It's like a restaurant owner buying a multi-million-dollar state-of-the-art commercial kitchen. They have the best ovens, the finest imported knives, stainless steel everything. The hardware is clearly there, but the chef in the kitchen is still only microwaving frozen dinners. The output, the actual creation of value, just isn't happening.
That analogy hits the nail on the head. Phase one of closing the digital divide is pure infrastructure access, laying the subsea fiber optic cables, installing the secure servers, expanding broadband access to the population. And to their credit, TTO has largely accomplished phase one. The hardware is in place.
But phase two?
Phase two is adoption and output. It is the ability of the society to convert that raw internet access into digital export revenue.
Why are they stuck at phase one? Why aren't they coding software or providing global remote engineering consulting?
Because phase two requires an alignment of human capital and institutions that TTO currently lacks. You need an education pipeline that trains people not just to consume the internet, not just to scroll social media, but to code, design, and engineer for it. And crucially, it goes back to our discussion on the institutional bottleneck.
Right, slide 6.
Yes. You need a business environment where a young tech startup can seamlessly incorporate secure venture capital and sell digital services to clients in Germany or Japan without massive bureaucratic friction. The data explicitly shows TTO has the servers, but lacks the ecosystem to utilize them.
And when you look at what the workforce is actually doing, the mismatch becomes glaringly obvious. Let's go to slide 13, the labor market. Picture a stacked bar chart of employment. Agriculture is non-existent. Industry absorbs a decent chunk. But the services sector absorbs a massive 60 to 70% of the total workforce. And when you isolate female employment, the data shows women's employment in the services sector sometimes exceeding 80%.
And this demographic clustering connects directly to those missing tech exports. When we hear the term services sector in the context of a highly developed, diversified economy like the UK or Singapore, we often think of high-value, knowledge-intensive services. We think of investment banking, software development, high-end engineering consulting.
But that's not what the services sector means here, is it?
No. In a resource-dependent economy struggling to diversify, the services sector is often heavily skewed toward local administration, retail, hospitality, and basic domestic commerce. It is low to medium value-added labor. It is people working in shops selling imported goods bought with oil money to other locals who work in the oil sector.
So even with that 90+% primary education completion rate.
Exactly. Even with a strong educational baseline, there is a profound structural mismatch. The economy is simply not generating the high-tech, knowledge-intensive jobs required to absorb an educated workforce. So the labor pools into local services that don't generate new intellectual property, and critically, do not bring in foreign currency.
Which leaves the entire nation incredibly exposed to global shocks. And that brings us to slide 14, our final piece of macroeconomic data before we synthesize all of this into a roadmap, macro trade vulnerability.
It's a combination of it all.
Right. Picture a wildly fluctuating line graph with wide error bands tracking the trade balance as a percentage of GDP. In some years, there are massive surpluses. But the absolute second global energy prices crash, deep, stark red deficits appear immediately.
This single metric ties our entire deep dive together. It is the culmination of every structural flaw we've discussed. TTO imports its food, because its agriculture sector withered under Dutch disease. It imports its consumer goods because local manufacturing struggles with currency inflation and institutional friction, and it pays for every single bit of this consumption with a single, highly volatile commodity: energy exports.
And they have zero leverage over that commodity. I mean, they don't set the price of oil?
No, they're absolute price takers in the global market. You have zero control over the primary variable that dictates their entire national income. When OPEC decides to increase production or a geopolitical crisis shifts natural gas demands in Europe, TTO's macroeconomic stability shakes violently. It makes their economy incredibly fragile despite the high-income label. They are a leaf on the ocean of global energy markets.
Okay, take a breath, listener. We have waded through a massive amount of complex data. We have looked at the wealth illusion of adjusted net savings, the environmental and institutional bottlenecks, the human capital crisis of NCDs and mismatched labor, and the deep structural vulnerabilities of an island that doesn't produce its own food. It is a lot to process. But data is only truly valuable if it provides a blueprint for the future.
Exactly. Diagnostics must lead to a prescription.
So let's bring up our final mental slide, slide 15. The core takeaway here is undeniable. Trinidad and Tobago is at a historic crossroads. They are currently trapped in the illusion of wealth, generating high cash flow through the depreciation of a finite resource, rather than building real, sustainable national savings.
The trust fund is depleting.
And the global economy is decarbonizing. So, based strictly on the data we've analyzed, what are the actionable, data-driven policy pivots? How does this nation save itself?
Synthesizing the data. A successful transition relies on three crucial pillars. Picture three simple icons on this final slide. First, a battery and a globe, pillar 1. Energy substitution. The nation must fundamentally change how it views oil and gas revenue. They must treat fossil fuel rents not as income to be consumed, but strictly as capital to be reinvested.
Okay, so every dollar generated from resource depletion needs to be relentlessly converted into renewable energy infrastructure and digital capital.
Exactly. They must build the bridge to the next economy while they still have the materials to pay for it.
Makes total sense. Stop spending the inheritance on lavish parties. Start investing it in a new business. What is Pillar 2? Picture a scale and a gavel.
Pillar 2 is governance. They must deliberately and aggressively push their rule of law and anti-corruption metrics above the global median. They have to break out of the middle-income institutional trap. The government must drastically reduce bureaucratic friction. This is the only way to reverse the negative FDI trends we saw and lure smart, long-term global capital back to the island.
They have to upgrade the institutional hardware so it can run the software of a diversified economy.
Precisely.
And the third pillar. Picture a brain and a digital network.
Pillar 3 is human capital. This requires a two-pronged approach. First, they must aggressively manage the non-communicable disease epidemic. Public health campaigns, taxing sugary imports, subsidizing whatever local agriculture remains. They have to protect the physical vitality of their prime-age workforce.
And the second prong.
Second, they have to align their education pipeline with their digital infrastructure. They have the servers right. Now they need to intentionally shift that massive service-heavy workforce toward high-value ICT exports. They have to train the chefs to use that state-of-the-art kitchen.
Wow. Okay, listener, as we wrap up, you might be wondering, why should you care about all of this? Unless you live in Port of Spain, why spend an hour deep diving into the macro data of a small Caribbean nation?
Because the lessons here are universally applicable.
Exactly. TTO's data is a masterclass in universal economic truths. It is the ultimate case study in the difference between earning and saving, between extracting value from the ground and actually creating intellectual and structural value. Whether you are running a multinational business, managing your own household budget, or just trying to be a more informed citizen of the global economy, the lesson here is profound.
It really is.
Your true wealth isn't the oil you pump out today. It isn't your current high salary. Your true wealth, the only thing that guarantees your future, is the human and institutional capital you build for tomorrow.
And that leads to a fascinating final thought for you to mull over. We have seen through this data how incredibly difficult it is for an economy to pivot away from fossil fuels. The inertia of the resource curse is immensely powerful. It warps the currency, it corrupts the institutions, it changes the very diet of the people.
It's an economic gravity well.
It is. But consider this. As the entire world slowly, inevitably marches toward decarbonization, dozens of nations from the Middle East to South America are going to face variations of this exact crisis. They will all have to figure out how to unwind their reliance on oil.
Right.
So what if Trinidad and Tobago's ultimate future export isn't energy? What if it isn't even software or digital services? What if their most valuable export to the world becomes the actual policy blueprint of how a small, heavily energy-dependent island nation successfully survives the resource curse and transitions to a sustainable economy?
Oh, wow.
If TTO can face this unvarnished data, if they can upgrade their institutions, align their human capital, and crack the code on this transition, that knowledge alone, that proven roadmap, might be their most valuable asset in the 21st century.
A roadmap for the survival of the resource-rich world. What an incredible thought to end on. And what a journey through the realities behind the numbers. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, for wrestling with the contradictions, and for looking past the illusion of wealth to find the true mechanics of an economy. Until next time, keep questioning the dashboard.